So again, as I mentioned, we have a lot of great experts to talk about our economy and our industry today. And the first person I want to bring up is one of my favorite speakers on the economy. He is a renowned economic forecaster around the nation, and also being a current Floridian and head of UCF's Institute for Economic Forecasting. He is also a Florida expert. So we get a double whammy of expertise today. We get to learn about the national economy and the Florida economy, which, by the way, is kicking some tail right now. So I'm anxious to hear what Sean has to say about that. Please welcome Dr. Sean Snaith from UCF.
Thank you. Good afternoon. When your daughters get older, Brad, they're going to respond to these dad jokes by calling you cringy, which is what my teens say to me when I try to do the same. But anyway, happy to be here speaking in front of this group. It's been a while, and glad to be back. And I do a fair amount of speaking around the state and around the country, and I want to take a little advantage of that fact, being in front of such an esteemed audience, to get up on a soapbox for just a minute here about a subject that is of growing concern to me, and that's the national debt. If you've looked at our U.S. forecast quarterly publication, I always have a few paragraphs that discuss the national debt and the deficit and some related statistics. But lately I've become increasingly concerned because there's been a convergence of events that was a bit worrisome to me, and that is, number one, the debt now exceeds $23 trillion. And there's a fringe group of economists that are pushing this notion called modern monetary theory, and I could see some eyes glassing over already, but I'm not going to get too deep in it. At the core of it is the notion that the debt doesn't matter, that the government can run up as much debt as it likes without consequence. And that, coupled with sort of the political discourse around Medicare for all, or paying everybody's student loans off, or a Green New Deal, all these new entitlement programs that could cost tens of trillions of dollars if enacted. So put that all together, to me it's a recipe for a potential problem. So I'm going to talk about the debt and the deficit just for a little while and get into the forecast. And I'm going to bookend my comments on the debt by drawing from two prolific American writers, Jay-Z and Ernest Hemingway. So the debt, as I said, has recently surpassed $23 trillion. So we got 23 trillion problems, you might say. But Fitch ain't one. And Fitch, the older realtors, you might have to Google that, but Fitch is one of the main bond rating agencies, Fitch, Standard & Poor's, and Moody's. And despite the fact that we have $23 trillion in debt, we continue to receive from these agencies, our government does, the highest possible rating on U.S. government bonds. And really, U.S. government bonds remain the yardstick by which all other bonds are measured in terms of default risk. They're considered default risk free. So Fitch isn't a problem right now, at least yet. And I'm concerned because the amount of the debt, as I said, is over $23 trillion. Who do we owe this debt to? Well, about 73% is held by the public, 27% is held in intra-government holdings. And so that is the federal pension program holds government debt, the Social Security Trust Fund, the Federal Reserve Bank holds that debt. And sometimes people point to the fact that, well, yeah, $23 trillion, but we owe most of that to ourselves. And it's true. 68% of the debt we owe in one way or another to ourselves, to this country. But that shouldn't be any comfort, because it's not like we can just wake up one morning and look in the mirror and have a Stu Smalley moment, where we say, well, we've been spending a little more than we should have, ran up this debt. Let's just call it even. We're going to do better going forward. I mean, that's just not an option. The other thing I wanted to point out is that the intergovernment holdings, and particularly the Social Security Trust Fund and the Federal Reserve holdings, these are unusual events that have allowed these agencies to absorb trillions of dollars of this debt. The Social Security Trust Fund has a surplus because the baby boom generation, the overwhelming majority of them are still in the workforce. They're still paying into Social Security, but eventually they're going to leave the workforce, which means, one, they're not paying in anymore. Two, they're going to start drawing down on that surplus. So that surplus is going away. Social Security isn't going to be there to swallow up trillions of dollars of government debt. And believe me, they don't care about default risk. They don't care about yield or anything like that. Same thing with the Federal Reserve. You know, we saw 3 rounds of what was known as quantitative easing, where the Fed was buying up trillions of dollars of government debt to fight the financial crisis and Great Recession. Well, hopefully that was a once-in-a-lifetime event, and we won't see the Fed, gobbling up debt like that in the future, which means this $5 trillion plus is going to have to be purchased by the public at large. And they do care about risk, and they do care about yield. So it's not as easy a sell. Is $23 trillion a lot? I think sometimes you start talking in trillions of dollars, most people can't really wrap their head around it, right? It's like when I watch a Stephen Hawking lecture and he's talking about some galaxy that's 20 billion light years away, and I'm just like, how long does it take to drive there? I mean, boy, if there's rest stops along the way. Yeah, it's hard to wrap your head around it. But the level of debt really doesn't matter. What matters is the ability of the country to service that debt. So for example, in 2010, in Greece, their debt crisis came to a head. And that precipitated a number of issues across Europe that persist till today. But they had, at the time of the crisis, a total debt of $380 billion. Oh man, that's chump change around here, right? We run that up in a few months, come on. But that was enough to tip that country's economy into crisis. Why? Well, their ability to pay and service that debt. A much smaller economy, a much less diverse economy. And so it's not the level of debt, but it's the ability to service it as measured by the debt to GDP ratio. And so the debt to GDP ratio in the US is about 107% right now. That's analogous to a debt to income level. Not exactly the same for a household, but 107%. That's not the highest it's ever been in U.S. economic history. The peak occurred at the tail end of World War II, but we're not in a world war right now, and yet we have this record level of debt. And what you see up on that table is a list of the top countries across the globe in terms of the level of debt to GDP. And if you look at that list, it's not one of those who's you'd like to be included in, right? I mean, Congo, Mozambique, Barbados, Lebanon. I mean, this is not a list of countries known for their fiscal responsibility. Japan's a little bit of an outlier up there. They've been trying to fight deflation for decades there, and in the process, their central bank has purchased a tremendous amount of their central government debt, and they also have been historically prolific savers in Japan, but not a great list to be on. So anyway, let me close this out. It's not something that can be ignored. With a little something from Hemingway, as I said. And the sun also rises. Bill Gordon and Mike Campbell are having a conversation, and you'll be shocked to know this conversation takes place in a bar, very unusual for a Hemingway novel. And anyway, Mike had gone bankrupt, and so Bill was asking him about the bankruptcy. So, hey, how did you go bankrupt? And Mike said, well, 2 ways. Gradually, then suddenly. And that's how debt crises work. You don't get a 10-year warning. You don't get a notice in the mail that, hey, U.S., you better fix something because 10 years from now, there's trouble down the road. It builds, and then it hits. So this notion that the debt doesn't matter is just asking for problems down the road. The Trump administration, man, after that election, which I didn't forecast, I'll tell you that, things were politically pretty pretty tense, right? There was a lot of tumultuousness right after the election happened. Thankfully, the political environment has really calmed down since then. But in terms of policy, which is really what I focus on, I'm not too interested in politics, but I have to pay attention to policies. The policies that we've seen implemented during this administration have and are very pro-growth for the U.S. economy. And the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is one of those big pieces of legislation that was put into place. Two components, reform of the individual tax code, reform of the corporate tax code. At the individual level, we had lower marginal tax rates at virtually every tax bracket. And that meant, from the moment those withholding tables came out, people were seeing more take-home pay in their paychecks. And this recovery for the first 7.5, 8 years, in addition to being historically weak in terms of growth of the economy, was also missing an ingredient of the previous recoveries, and that was wage and salary growth, which was lingering around 1% for much of that recovery. So suddenly people had more take-home pay in their check. The near doubling of the standard deduction meant that for many people under this new law, they were able to avoid itemizing when they filed their taxes. And so that's a hidden benefit for the economy because according to the IRS, it takes about 24 hours to complete the 1040 process. And so, you take your little shoebox full of faded receipts out of the closet, and then by the time you submit your tax return, 24 hours has gone into the process. That's more than a half of a work week of woman power and manpower that's going to do nothing other than pay your taxes. So it is a loss to society that this law actually helped recoup. Caps on mortgage and state and local tax deductions. Not a popular feature of the law in New York, New Jersey, Illinois, California. It turns out it was a hidden benefit for Florida's economy because what it's done is tilted the table even further in our favor in terms of the tax environment. And anecdotally, we're already seeing evidence of that. Historically, most of the in-migrants to Florida have come from two states, New York and New Jersey. Two of the states hardest hit by this cap. So that is helping to catalyze and will continue to help catalyze in-migration into the state. At the corporate tax level, the corporate tax rate nominally was lowered from 35 to 21%. 35 was the highest tax rate in the industrialized world. Our effective tax rate was probably the third or fourth highest. But nonetheless, it was much higher than our global competitors. And so this was incentivized corporations to play a bit of a shell game globally where they shifted production and profits to different locations around the world in an attempt to minimize their tax bill. And it gave rise to a consulting sector known as transfer pricing, who advised their clients on how to play this particular shell game. Move this to Ireland, this goes down here, and all of a sudden your tax bill goes down. By cutting the corporate tax rate, the incentive to play the game simply for tax purposes has been removed. And furthermore, the law had a provision for the repatriation of profits which were being held overseas by U.S. companies at an even lower 15.5% rate. And so thus far, we've seen over $1 trillion repatriated from outside the U.S. back into the U.S. economy, bringing with it a windfall of revenue for the government, but even more importantly, a source of capital that's able to be reinvested in the U.S. economy. The biggest name that has come out of this thus far was Apple, who announced a few months after the law was signed that they were repatriating $250 billion that they were holding overseas. I guess in a giant silver apple on the Cayman Islands is where they hid it. I don't know. But they were bringing it back. They were going to invest in equipment. They're going to build a second Apple headquarters. They're going to invest in training their workers. And so this is really, in the long run, where workers are going to see a benefit of this particular law. When the law was first passed, a lot of companies came out and announced one-time bonuses. We're going to give all of our employees $1,500, $2,000. And it was immediately derided politically. It was, oh, look, workers get crumbs, corporations get billions. This is a terrible law. But the reality is, You see surveys from the Federal Reserve that say, 70% of US households don't have $500 on hand for an emergency car repair. Well, suddenly $1,500 or $2,000 doesn't look like crumbs. It looks like a foot-long sub. And there's nothing wrong with that, but the real benefit over time is the investment stimulus that this act is providing. And investment is what drives wage and salary growth, because investment increases productivity. I guess I could plug Sun Stats here, Brad, right? This will make all of you more productive because of the investment that the realtors have made. But investment drives productivity. Productivity drives wage and salary growth. I could be the most efficient, hardest working irrigation ditch digger that's ever walked the face of the planet. But if the only tool I have at my disposal is a shovel, this is going to limit the number of foot trench I can dig in a given workday. You take my shovel away and give me a backhoe, what happens? Well, suddenly I'm much more productive. And I'm more valuable to my employer. I'm able to command a higher wage and salary as a result. So that's where workers, I think, in the long run are going to benefit from this law. The other area that I think is really positive for growth has been the administration's review of regulation in the economy. Much needed regulatory relief. In the first year, the administration had 22 deregulatory actions for every one. In the second year, it was 13 to 1. In the third year, it's back up close to 20 to 1. So a real revisitation of the regulatory structure in the US economy. And now I know regulation's not the most enticing topic. I mean, it never works for me at parties, but it matters. Regulation matters. Regulations are not implemented in a vacuum. I teach my students a regulation's like a tax. When you tax something, you get less of that. When you regulate something, you get less of that. And so I'm breaking a rule here, which is I never talk about academic research in front of normal people. Now, back in the terrarium of academia, and I do need to get back there. My skin's already drying out here in the real world. I can feel it. We write these little scrolls that professors pass back and forth to one another, and we sit on toadstools, and we read each other's scrolls and congratulate one another on how clever we have been to have written such a scroll. Why, thank you. You can have tenure. Thank you. This is great. But most people don't ever need to see these scrolls. But this is an exception. I came across this journal article in the Journal of Economic Growth, and the title, as you could tell, very eye-catching. Federal regulation and aggregate economic growth. I mean, who wouldn't pick that up, right? But the reason it caught my eye is because it was looking how regulation was impacting the economy as a whole, which is what aggregate means, the macro impacts of regulation. Usually regulation is about microeconomics. Let's look at a specific industry. Let's look at a specific regulatory action and analyze that. These authors were saying, hey, what has regulation done to the economy as a whole? How has the US economy been impacted in terms of productivity and in terms of economic growth? And so they looked at the US economy from 1949 to 2005. Now, the first hurdle they had to overcome was, well, how do you measure regulation in the aggregate, right? No two regulations within a single industry have the same impacts, let alone regulations across all industries in the entire economy. And so they came up with a proxy, and that proxy is depicted on the screen in front of you. It's the number of pages in the Code of Federal Regulations. That's the great big book of federal regulations. It's the Encyclopedia Britannica, for those of you old enough to remember that, filled with federal regulations. And in 1949, there were less than 20,000 pages in the code. By the end of their sample period, 2005, there was close to 140,000 pages. So tremendous growth over those decades, in particular the 1970s, where there was a rapid acceleration of regulatory activity, and the number of pages in the code doubled in that decade alone. So what did the authors find? How does regulation impact the US economy? Well, they found that on average, from 1949 to 2005, regulation reduced real GDP growth by an average of 2% per year. Now, is that a lot or a little? Well, it turns out the miracle, or tragedy in this case, of compounding means that 2% less every year from 1949 to 2005 meant that in 2011, real GDP, which was actually 15.1 trillion, would have been almost $54 trillion if regulations had been held at 1949 levels. Well, now the authors in this article, nor am I here today, suggesting that we roll back regulations to where they were in 1949. I mean, it's nice, we'll walk out of the hotel today, we won't have to put on a mask to breathe because the air is not polluted. The food and beverages you had at lunch, you can be pretty sure aren't going to kill you. At least in the short run. I don't know, how healthy you had lunch today. Over time, it could build up in the arteries, but nonetheless, there are some regulations that make sense. I mean, I remember as a child growing up this ongoing conundrum I faced as to whether or not to eat the paint chips that had fallen off the window onto the windowsill. And, they had a nice visual appeal and a really nice mouthfeel. But I knew with every crunch I was risking neurological damage because paint back then had lead in it. Kids today can eat the paint chips. There's no lead in paint anymore. And that's a different texture than the Tide Pods that they're currently eating. But my point being, some regulations make sense, but you have to weigh the benefits of the regulation against the costs. And we've gone on a decades-long regulatory rampage where I don't think that type of analysis has been carried out enough. And I've focused a lot of my discussion during this recovery and blaming the slowness of this recovery on things like the Dodd-Frank financial regulatory law, which at 2,600 pages, signed into law in 2010. By the way, it's still not fully implemented. It's like, can God create a rock that even God can't lift? I mean, can DC create regulations that even DC can't implement, right? And a lot of unintended consequences here. So I think revisiting these and other regulations, say, listen, does this make sense? Do the benefits of this regulation exceed the cost? If not, it's time, let's chuck it. Let's move on. So that, to me, is the secret sauce for economic growth. I think that is going to help boost growth in the near term and well beyond. Productivity was also impacted by regulatory growth. In the 1970s, there was a conundrum in the economics discipline. Productivity growth remained quite low. This was despite, in the 1970s, a number of advances in telecommunication, computerization, other technologies that really should have boosted productivity, but it wasn't showing up in the numbers. Well, it turns out most of that conundrum, these authors found, can be solved by the fact that regulation grew at such a rapid rate during the 1970s. Well, guess what's been going on in the US economy recently? Another productivity conundrum. We've got these phones in our pocket and these tablets that have computing power that the space shuttle didn't have on board, and all these tools at our disposal. You would think our productivity numbers would be boosted by that. But again, we haven't seen it, and some economists are puzzled. Well, guess what? We've been on another regulatory binge since the early 2000s. I would start with the Patriot Act in the wake of 9/11 and all the way through the Affordable Care Act, the Dodd-Frank recently. And so I think what we're seeing is another replay of this regulatory reduced productivity issue. What about trade? This has been a worrisome thing about this administration for many economists. With NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, we were negotiating that, renegotiating that with Canada and Mexico. People were worried we're going to pull out of the NAFTA altogether. In fact, the administration threatened to do just that. And people are, oh my God, we're not going to trade with Canada and Mexico anymore. Where am I going to get my avocados? This is going to be the worst thing ever. This is going to turn out horribly. Well, what happened? We ended up with a new version of the North American Free Trade Agreement, USMCA. It is an improvement over the original. I don't like the acronym so much, USMCA. It doesn't roll off the tongue the way NAFTA did, but I mean, I can live with it because it's better than NAFTA, and it will benefit the US economy. Trade agreements, and NAFTA was agreed to in the early 90s. Trade agreements are not the 10 Commandments. They don't get handed down the mountain, etched in stone, never to be touched or revisited again, right? I mean, you don't change the Ten Commandments, Sunday or your Bible study class. Fred's been really getting on my nerves. This thou shalt not kill. I mean, do we need it? You don't do that. But with trade agreements, I mean, the world's economy is vastly different than it was in the early 1990s. These things must be revisited and updated. And it's become, I think, will be a benefit to the U.S. economy. Same thing with the China situation. We've gotten the phase one of a trade agreement with China. There was no trade agreement in place, so it wasn't a revisiting, it was an establishing one. And I think ultimately this will be resolved, and it needed to be addressed for a variety of reasons that extend well beyond trade, but I'm not going to get into hegemony globally or anything like that. But intellectual property theft has long been a problem with China and the U.S. economy, so it's addressing this. And it, too, will benefit the U.S. economy. And so this is a pattern. I don't know if you've noticed it. This administration announces or says something or takes some action, and the immediate reaction is it's the end of the world as we know it. We saw it with North Korea. Right? Remember, after the election, North Korea had been misbehaving. They were detonating nuclear warheads. They were testing ballistic missiles. And so, well, what did the president do? Oh, of course, he started tweeting. Starts calling him Little Rocket Man and says, my nuclear button's bigger than your nuclear button, and mine works. And people are like, oh my God, this guy's going to get us into a nuclear war, and my kids are coming home from school. Daddy, we did duck and cover drills today. And I'm like, oh. I thought we passed all that. And what was the end result? Nuclear war? No. Have we solved the problem of that peninsula? No. But I would say we probably made more progress than had been made in the previous 3 decades combined. And so this pattern keeps repeating itself, and we see it over and over again. So next time you hear an initiative that's followed by an end-of-the-world prediction, just maybe take a deep breath and let's see how it plays out, because I think these trade things have turned out far better than many have thought. The U.S. labor market is extremely strong right now. We are in the 11th year of this economic recovery. It is the longest economic recovery in U.S. history. And there's really no indication that it's going to come to an end anytime soon. We're at or near full employment. I think we're near, not necessarily there, even though the unemployment rate is at 3.5%. Coming up through school, we were never taught that it could even get that low. 5.5% to 6.5% was considered full employment back in those days. But the unemployment rate's not the best measure of the tightness of the labor market. What I'm watching is how quickly are wages and salaries growing. That will tell us when, in fact, we have hit full employment, at least nationally. But this is good. The labor market is strong by virtually any measure. Voluntary separations, quit rates are at 19-year highs. The number of available jobs greatly exceeds the number of people seeking them. Any measure you really look at in the labor market, things are very strong. I think the Fed is going to sit tight in 2020. They went through some mid-cycle adjustments. That's Fed speak for we raised rates too soon without reason. But that's okay. They're fighting the ghost of inflation's past. And the institutional memory of the 1970s, I think, is still very powerful. And the Fed did not want to risk a replay of the inflation of that decade. I think the U.S. economy will continue to grow. We'll see what happens in 2020. I had to change my forecast after the 2016 election. I might have to change it again in 2020, but I think the expansion continues. I think there's enough momentum. I think consumers, who are 70% of the U.S. economy, are in really good footing. Confidence is high, incomes are rising, the labor market's robust. And that, to me, is going to be enough to carry things forward. I think, and Brad will probably get into it, I think the housing industry is also going to provide some ongoing boost as we address the shortage globally. Florida, things are doing great. We're doing better than the national economy as a whole and have been since 2012. Population growth continues to feed economic growth. This river of new Floridians, 900 plus a day, is fed by 3 tributaries: domestic migrants, international migrants, and birth rates exceeding death rates. We're making Floridians faster than we're losing them. And so, I'm not. I might be responsible for losing a few, death by boredom, but if there was a coin that on one side had population growth, on the flip side of that coin would be economic growth. Cities in the Rust Belt, states in the Rust Belt, all have a common denominator. They have stagnant or declining populations. You put more people in a region, that region's economy grows by default. Now, there's growing pains that are coming with Florida's growth, and I think those are focused on our transportation network, and that ties into affordable housing, but again, I'm going to stay away from housing. Unemployment in Florida is down around 3.3%. The last time we saw that was at the height of the housing bubble, which was an unsustainable economic phenomena that was driving the economy at that time. We don't have a similar situation right now. There is not this single sector that is overheated and driving the whole economy. We have growth across the board in Florida. And we think that Florida's GDP will continue to grow at an even faster rate than what we're seeing nationally. Payroll employment, the labor market in Florida is super robust. We continue to see strong job growth, almost twice the rate at which we're seeing nationally, and record low levels of unemployment around the state. What sectors are doing well? Professional business services, we're projecting, is going to be the top grower over the next several years. Construction, of course, between infrastructure and residential and commercial real estate, there's a lot of activity around the state. Tourism continues to thrive. It has, faced some headwinds, whether it was Zika or red tide or hurricanes or, you name it, things that were supposedly going to slow things down. That just hasn't occurred. And again, back to the consumer being in a good situation, that also helps that particular industry. Population growth, still solid statewide, varies, around the state. Central Florida, very strong. You see Lakeland actually benefiting from its location on I-4 in between Tampa and Orlando, 2 very large and growing metro areas in the state. I want to say right now, or historically, we have produced forecasts for 12 metro areas around the state. Beginning at the end of March, our Florida forecast publication will have forecasts for every metropolitan area across the state of Florida, so you'll be able to have information no matter what part of the state you're doing business in. So population growth is solid, and so is job growth, not surprisingly. Central Florida, the Orlando metro area, is one of the strongest job markets in terms of job creation in the entire country. And if you look around the state, you see just solid job growth that, for the most part, is above what we're seeing nationally. That's Orlando. There's a diverse crowd. I'll skip that. But thank you very much. I'm out of time, and appreciate you having me here today.
Nice. Not product placement. This is just not a flat podium, so I'm going to put this up here. Just water. Interesting. Let's see what. No. Sean just mentioned his Metro reports. They are an incredibly useful tool, and not only that, they're free. You can go to the UCF Institute for Economic Forecasting website and download them. They put them out quarterly, and again, he said they do several metros already and give you very detailed information about what's going to happen in his estimation over the next several quarters. And I think they're 100% guaranteed to be right. Isn't that right, Sean?
Money back.
Okay. Clicking. Oh, there we go. Sorry. Here we go. So if any of you were able to see my mid-year update that I gave at convention, we had just had the yield curve flip, which caused everyone to go bananas. Or everyone who was paying attention to that kind of thing started going bananas about a recession being imminent because it's such a predictor of a recession. And I started out my talk by saying, Well, there is some evidence that it's, not necessarily a direct cause, but might be indicative of something happening. And I would point out that everyone on Google is searching the word recession right now at a very high rate. This is in August I showed this chart. And I said, before that, I prefaced it by saying, I think this is a very different situation, and I don't see any real signs we're heading into a recession. But as soon as I showed you that chart, you all started ignoring me. So I just wanted to give you an update. The panic is over. It was just a very short-term thing. And as Sean just showed you, the national economy, all the things we were worrying about even 6 months ago, that's gone away. There's still a little bit more concern than there has been in past years about where we're going, but I don't see any panic out there right now. Touching on population growth, because not only is it a driver of our economy, as Sean mentioned, but also of housing in particular, I wanted to start out by going over, basically, as Sean started alluding to, the importance of migration. I wanted to run some statistics by you just to show you what's going on in terms of where our new residents are coming from now that our population growth rate has really recovered from the downturn 10 years ago. We're seeing a lot of that. This is a similar chart to what he showed you, except I'm showing you the growth in these metros since 2010, okay? So, and the rank on the right-hand side is their US rank. We have about 400 metro areas in the US. And we have 12 of our 22 MSAs, or metro areas in Florida, are in the top 50 in terms of growth over that time span. And number one in the country is the villages. The number of village people is now estimated to be in excess of 130,000. So if you look through this list, there's a lot of areas that are normally associated with retirement, not necessarily completely, but people who are have done well for themselves and are looking for a place to settle down. Along the coast, we have much of Southwest Florida on this list. We have up on the Panhandle, we got the Emerald Coast area, and the Treasure Coast too. And then 3 of our mega cities here in Florida are also on this list, Orlando being the highest at 9th in the country in terms of all metros. And for metros above 2 million in population, it is the 2nd fastest growing after Austin, Texas. And believe me, I've noticed it when I'm trying to get home. It takes me twice as long to get home now as it did 9 years ago. And I don't even have to get on I-4. We'll add Lakeland in there too, advantageous position for them. But in migration to other states, from other states to Florida, this is what it looked like in 2018. The size of the bubble is how many people are coming, and the shading is the darker it is, the more intense that movement was. In other words, Connecticut is darker than New York because more Connecticut, what's someone from Connecticut called? Margie, help me out. Connecticut people. Connectors. More people per capita from Connecticut are moving to Florida than per capita from New York, so it's more intense migration. However, in the sheer number of it, we get more New Yorkers than from any other state. Right now, it's New York at 60-something thousand, followed by Georgia, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Jersey. Now, one thing we don't often focus on in Florida, maybe it's a dark secret that we have, people actually leave. And a lot of people leave actually every year. This past year, we had 50,000 people go to Georgia and 37,000 to North Carolina, Texas, Tennessee, and New York. Make up your mind. Are you going to be here or there? So if you look at it on net, from most states, we are gaining population on net. New York being the biggest. So on net, we net about 38,000 New Yorkers every year, and then followed by New Jersey. As far where people are leaving, they're going to Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, North Carolina, and Oklahoma, and again, look at that number, it's only 2,000. I thought Oklahoma was known more for out-migration, but I read The Grapes of Wrath in high school. But no, we're losing people to Oklahoma. What's with that? Come on, get your game on, Florida. But no offense to Oklahoma. But those top 4, though, Georgia, because of its proximity, and Atlanta and the great economy up there, and then Nashville is just off the charts crazy right now in terms of growth and doing very well, and so is Austin, Texas, as I just mentioned. So that's where we're losing some people. So Sean also touched on the SALT cap and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So you're thinking all these New Yorkers are moving here. It's because we capped the SALT tax, right? Well, that's 2018. That migration stat was 2018. That would be the first year where you were going to actually not have that cap when you paid your taxes at the beginning of 2019. So that's what's spurring so many New Yorkers down here? Well, not only would people be interested maybe in, if that was their motive for moving, coming to Florida, but there are actually 7 states with no income taxes, Florida being one of them. There are also 2 states, New Hampshire, that don't tax your personal income, but they do tax dividends and interest, and so does Tennessee, although they are phasing that out. So they will be with us in the list of completely no income tax states very soon. So what I did is I took all of the states, I removed those states I just showed you from my list, and I put everyone else up here with IRS, and I stacked some IRS data, and I'm going to show you. There were 95, this is tax year 27, so in early 2018 when people filed their taxes for 2017, there were this many tax returns that came in with adjusted gross income levels between 1 and 100 grand. And that made up about 80% of all returns in from no tax states. So it just goes to show you the income distribution. For 100 to 200,000, there were about 15 million tax returns that came in from income tax states. Over here, I'm going to show you the number of people who took the deduction. This is your last year to take the deduction before the new tax law goes into effect. Only about 16% of filers between 1 and 100,000 actually took a state and local income tax deduction. And the average amount of those who did was about $3,000. Okay, so let's look at 100 to 200,000 range. Surely that will be higher. Well, it was. Probably 60, 70% of people filing their taxes in that income range used the deduction, and it was for an average of $7,250. Okay, let's start getting into the money here, 200 to 500. Now we're getting closer to like 95% of people are taking this deduction, and the average is about 17,000. And so on until you get to, let's look at the big number here. If you're making over $1 million and you live in an income tax state, the average amount you were deducting as of the last year that they would have let you deduct all of it was close to $300,000. And here are all the states by the number of people who have people making over $1 million a year in aggregate or adjusted gross income. You can tell that New York and California have the most people making that kind of money. And the average there, that's what I've shaded the circles as, is much higher than the average I just showed you. So 80,000 people filed that they had adjusted gross income, 1 million plus, and 454,000 was the average. It's an average, so it's going to be skewed up by the really ultra-rich people, but that's a large number. So you might, not want to. Now, if you're making that kind of money, maybe that's nothing to you and you don't care. But it seems a lot bigger than the 3,000 I might have had to pay, or 4,000 or whatever. So, paying taxes on that kind of money, that's a big deal. But in migration from New York State, if we're looking at 2018, the first year where people would have been aware that this is coming down and they're going to have to start, they won't be able to deduct their state and local income tax anymore, we didn't really see much in the number. Well, why is that? Partly because it's 2018 and maybe people hadn't decided to move yet, and we're waiting on the 2019 data later this year. But part of it is that the vast majority of people I just showed you in that breakdown, it's only $3,000 that they're going to have to pay taxes on. That's not going to be a motive. So if you were expecting everyone from New York to move to Florida because of that tax change, you're wrong. Now, there are going to be super rich people who might want to do that for various reasons. And of course, it's not that simple. New York doesn't make it very easy to leave and stop paying taxes. We actually have a high number of Floridians who, for some reason, are economically tied to the north and still have to pay income tax at the state and local level. If they're, you can't just leave your business there and come down here. So, if you're a hedge fund manager, if you're Carl Icahn, if you're Donald Trump, it's probably easy for you to make that move. And those are two of the prominent names who have announced that they are becoming Florida residents. But the point being isn't not to get excited about the SALT tax driving people down here, but the point here being There's been a huge incentive for these people to move down here all along before the SALT tax cap happened. Imagine if not only do you not have to pay taxes on that $484,000, but you don't have to pay $484,000 in income tax at all. And how do you do that? You move to Florida. It's been known for a while that you can come down here without and no longer pay that state and local income tax. So it's definitely got the conversation going and are making people think twice about it. So I would keep driving that into people's minds. But if we're expecting a huge flood, my expectations are a little tempered on that. Immigration from other states by age group. Just really quickly wanted to say 2006, right before everything went bad, we were getting about 11% of our in-migration out of 65 plus individuals in terms of age, and then the bracket below that, 55 to 64, about 10%. That actually ratio continued to persist for a couple of years, even after the economy changed. But lately, we're seeing more like close to 20% of our in-migrants are in that 65 plus age. So just wanted you to make you aware of that. The economic downturn of the last decade really delayed movement of boomers to Florida, and we keep reading about people staying in place instead of, or aging in place and not moving down here. Well, we've actually seen a fairly good high degree of movement in that area. There are boomers coming down here. Same thing from abroad, the same trends, although the people moving in from abroad tend to be skewing a little bit younger than the people who are moving down here who are domestic residents. Wanted to look overall. This is going to be a very important chart to be following over the next few years. This is our population distribution by age. So from left to right, it goes by your year of birth. And so the bigger your own personal little generation is, then the more people there are that represents. And you'll notice that peak over there in the millennials, we are about to hit peak millennial. That peak is about where the 30-year-old millennials are. So everyone to the left of that is older than 30, everyone to the right is younger. Okay? And you're gonna notice there's not as many people behind it. So we've got to figure out how to get housing for all these millennials right now. But then what? Then we have a market full of, how is our population smaller? Is our population declining? Well, I'm going to split this up. I'm going to split these into two parts. I'm going to split our population in terms of those who were born here in the US and those who weren't. The lighter area on top is people who are foreign-born who live in the United States. And the bottom is those who were born in the United States. The reason why the left side of our chart is bigger than the right side isn't because necessarily we're not having any babies. I know I am. I don't know, Sean says he isn't, but I am. The reason is because immigration fuels our population growth and our economy. And that will continue to happen. It happens, a lot of these people who are foreign-born might have moved here as youngsters, some as older people, but it's a huge chunk of our population, and it's going to continue. And so it's going to drive up the demand for housing at the back end of the millennials, so not much to worry about there. But what we do really need to focus on right now is those millennials who are coming into the market who we haven't been able to serve yet in terms of homes to purchase. I'm going to kind of skip through this a little bit more quickly than I had planned, but I just wanted to point out, speaking of foreign-born people, our economy benefits from people not necessarily even moving here from other countries. They can just buy a home here. And we had a bit of a rough year in that respect. Nationwide, international buyers were down about 30%, international purchases of real estate. And you can see here, we've got a low of about 9% of our existing home sales were purchased by foreign buyers and 12% of the dollar volume. That said, the distribution across the state remained pretty much the same. About half of them buy in South Florida, followed by Orlando, Tampa, and Southwest Florida. And again, the distribution was pretty much the same. So that was a bit of a concern when we saw that, but what we knew at the time we got this data in is that overall, I mean, it's going to hurt you if you specialize in international, obviously, but overall for our economy, we were okay because domestic buyers were really picking up the slack and then some. After about 4 or 5 straight years of pretty tepid growth in closed sales, last year we did about 6% more in terms of single-family homes. And in terms of condos and townhouses, we were down about 1%. But that really varies by market. It depends on what market you're in with that. Some were doing okay, some aren't. But that 6% growth number was pretty exciting to see. We hadn't seen one that big in a while. It was not exciting for my forecast, which said 1% growth, but I'm happy to be wrong on that side. So in terms of dollar volume, we topped for the first time ever since we started tracking our data, and I presume in forever, we topped over $100 billion of single-family home sales last year. That dollar volume being up 8.3%. And in condos, despite the fact we had fewer sales, higher prices allowed us to still bring in a positive amount of dollar volume compared to last year. Breaking it down by county, so we had 6% growth in single-family homes and a slight drop in condos. Well, it was spread throughout most of the state. The orange circles are states where the number of sales grew in 2019 versus 2018. And it was pretty diverse across the state. Just looking at single family, really strong throughout Central Florida, especially towards Lakeland and Tampa. And then for condos, sales dipped a little bit, although Miami, Dade County, we actually saw a 2% increase. Some of those luxury condos actually were moving at a much faster rate than we've seen before, so not all bad news. Active inventory. Well, this is something that's really changed over the past year. At the end of last year, our inventory for the first time in forever was really rising statewide. But you can see that peak, that was short-lived. As soon as those interest rates dropped, we started to see that inventory move pretty quick by March, April, May. And so as of right now, we're down about 11.4% in terms of listings, with a month supply of about 3.4 on the single-family side, and down about 10% in condo and townhouse inventory as well. Although a little bit more of a balanced market there. We have 5.2 months supply of inventory. Breaking it down by price tier, just looking at the single family, the shortage has mostly been driven by these homes, under $200,000. They've become very scarce, although that's kind of what got our attention last year. I'll show you in a minute. Everything else has been pretty flat in terms of inventory. So it's really the most affordable homes that we're really looking for in this market that's driving our inventory shortage. The inventory, again, has been stable elsewhere. But what we noticed at the end of 2018 is, for the first time in a while, inventory was going up. Not only was it going up in every price tier. Look at that, it was even going up in the sub $200,000 price tier. I didn't have time, but I would have liked to see, maybe you can tell me, what kind of homes in 2018 were selling for under $200,000 and that were coming on the market, because they were coming on the market faster than we could clear them for a little while. Again, the interest rates changed all that. As soon as the interest rates started to drop for mortgages, this year we're kind of back to where we were. Everybody's dropping though, not just those mid-tier and lower tier priced homes, but even the upper tier priced homes, the inventory is flagging some. In part, that is driven just by strong sales that have been driven by the interest rates. Looking at inventory by county, again, statewide phenomenon. Almost everywhere you live, your inventory is down. Overall, for single family, and for condos. Condo inventory down pretty much everywhere. Median sale price. Again, we forecasted about a 4% growth in median sale price for both condos and single-family homes last year, and we were actually spot on that. So you can forget everything else I was wrong about. We were right about this. Not for completely a different reason than we thought, though. But single-family homes up about 4%, and condos and townhouses up about 4%. That's dramatically slower than we've seen in recent years. We were 7-something% last year, or in 2018, and in double digits for many years before that. This is something we thought was coming just because we thought inventory would eventually be so restricted that that sales would slow down and demand would slow down. So nice to see that. This is a price index we build. Every year, it's a little bit outdated by now because it only shows through March of this year. But we break down into price tiers by current value, what has happened to prices of those groups of homes over time. So anything currently valued from 0 to 200,000, we indexed those homes going back for several years so we could see those types of homes, how fast were they growing. And then on the other end, those pink and magenta lines near the bottom are more expensive tiers, 400,000 and up and 600,000 and up. There's some overlap there. And what it shows is what we kind of all have known has been going on, which is that the higher price homes, there's just not as much demand versus supply for those, and so they've been appreciating at a lower rate. And really, it's been that 0 to 200 category and 200 to 300 that have been growing at the fastest rates in terms of prices. So those homes are appreciating the most, and that trend still continues right now. This took a long time for us to build, and we ended up looking at this chart for a long time, and eventually we noticed that it kind of looks like Jabba the Hutt with lipstick on. Thought I had to share that. It also looks a little like Grimace, but we think Jabba, a little bit closer to Jabba. I'm not going to get too much into construction because we're actually going to talk about that in a minute quite a bit, but the levels of new construction in both multifamily and single family are back to pre-crazy time levels. And that's a good sign because we need to catch up in that respect. Median years lived in current home has not changed over the last year. It's still historically high, up close to 10 years. So not only do we whine about there not being enough construction, but we're also not getting enough people to list their homes for a variety of reasons. Potentially interest rate lock-in is one of the best explanations right now as to why people aren't moving out of their homes. Underwater homes aren't really a problem anymore like they were. We were at 50% underwater at 2010. Now we're less than 10%, way less than 10%. So why would you not upgrade right now? Well, one reason is I've got this great rate and I don't want to give it up. There's only been 2 points in the last, going back to 1970, when we've had lower interest rates than we do right now. And both of those were in this housing cycle. So a lot of people locked into those rates back then, and that's maybe why we're not seeing as many people move right now, because it's pretty much the same as it was then. We might need to see them go a little lower. I will tell the interest rate gods to do that for you. But they don't often listen to me, or any economist, because we all missed the low interest rates this year. Again, we can follow the Fed. What the Fed's doing is important and tangentially affects pretty much everything. But it is worth noting that our mortgage interest rates are actually more closely tied to the 10-year bond rate than to whatever the Fed is moving. So keep a closer eye on what bonds are doing. And bonds are going to keep low yields if we continue to have low inflation, and no one thinks that's changing anytime soon. And there's, pretty stable but not decreasing concern about a mortgage being down the road, or a recession being down the road at some point. That's going to help keep bond rates low, and those are tied to our mortgages. So we're going to want to keep following that. But I guess the final point I wanted to make, I'm showing you here median sale price for single family homes and condos on the top chart. And on the bottom chart is kind of an estimated monthly mortgage payment I based off of NAR's methodology that they use in their housing affordability index. So basically an estimate making certain assumptions of what the typical family will pay on a mortgage given current prices for homes. And what you'll notice is that median sale price continues to still go up, but the monthly mortgage payment last year was actually much lower typically than it was the year before that. That's what caused our surge in closed sales. In terms of condos and townhomes, the same phenomenon. So it is And not only that, but now it's easier to get a condo loan, as many of you know, thanks to the GSE's changes. So this continues to be a good time to buy, simply because of these low rates. Again, like I was talking about with those factors that influence interest rates, we don't expect in the near term any of those to really change next year. So most economists are forecasting about a 3.8% rate on average throughout the next year. So we're not getting back up into those fours if we're all right about that. That's going to be a good environment for sales to continue. So I think my only concern is that inventory shrunk so much and we had rates plummet. Why didn't prices go up even more than they did? So that's something I'm going to keep an eye on. But overall, I think we could see a similar amount of price appreciation over this next coming year, around 4%. And then on the single family side, I think sales, it really depends on if the rates stay where they're at or not. But I think we could see another 4% of closed sales growth this year too. I'm pretty optimistic about that.